Welcome, everybody, to another edition of All In with Art Stapleton, a New York Giants podcast brought to you by NorthJersey.com and The Record. I am your host, Art Stapleton, and the bye week is over, and it's goodbye to an era at quarterback for the New York Giants. Daniel Jones benched yesterday morning. We're recording this on Tuesday. So Monday morning, Brian Daboll informed the quarterbacks and then the full team that they were making a change at quarterback, which, let's be honest, if you watch that game in Germany, it really crystallized everything that has not gone well for Daniel Jones this season. That flea flicker that the Giants missed, that was all on Jones. And I think from there, going into the bye week, I think the Giants realized that Jones was not only missing plays, but the plays that he was trying to make. Two interceptions against Carolina. One was ball placement on the interception that went to Tyrone Tracy. And then the other one was another red zone interception, and that was trying to throw the ball through Jadeveon Clowney's face mask. Those two plays really cost the Giants in Germany. And then obviously going back, we did not do a post-game podcast. I was not in Germany, so I covered the game essentially like the rest of you, watching it and then making calls afterwards, trying to get a feel for what was going on with the Giants. So 2-8, Daniel Jones to the bench. Tommy DeVito, North Jersey's own, the pride of Cedar Grove, is now back in the saddle for the Giants. We'll talk about that. And then where the Giants go from here. So we wanted to do a reaction to the Jones coming out of the bye, the Jones news coming out of the bye, DeVito. So I'm going to hit on as many topics as I can today, and we'll see if we can get another episode in later in the week, kind of resetting and looking at the Tampa Bay game on Sunday. But let's be honest, sitting at 2-8, I know a lot of you are sitting there every day or every weekend looking at tankathon.com and refreshing to see where the Giants are picked. Right now, they are currently projected to pick fourth. That Cowboys' loss on Monday night was big in terms of strength of schedule. Remember, it is the worst strength of schedule that determines tiebreakers in the order of the draft picks. So by the Cowboys losing, the Giants' strength of schedule dropped under the Las Vegas Raiders' strength of schedule. So now the Giants are fourth, the Raiders are fifth, and in essentially a two-quarterback race. At least that's the way it's shaping up right now in the draft, with Shedeur Sanders of Colorado and Cam Ward of Miami. I like to put Jalen Milroe in there a little bit from Alabama. He's my dark horse in terms of traits and just an intriguing player. I'd put all three of them potentially in the top 10 or top 12. But when you're talking about where this team sits, the race for the number one is not going to be easy. Jacksonville is sitting there right now for the number one pick. It will be interesting to see if Jacksonville, I know there's a lot of dead money cap hit perspective if they were to move on from Trevor Lawrence, but I floated this out there in my candidate story for who's going to be quarterback of the Giants next year, is that what if Shad Khan and the ownership group in Jacksonville says we need a complete makeover. Let's bring in Deion Sanders as head coach. Let's draft Shedeur Sanders, his son, as the quarterback, and let's move forward with, team prime. That leaves Trevor Lawrence and his $275 million contract out there. And do the Jacksonville Jaguars then look to trade Trevor Lawrence? At age 25, I would look, certainly if I were the Giants, to get involved in something like that. But that's all speculation on my part, connecting dots, seeing the way things are. But first and foremost, let's address the Daniel Jones era and a little bit of a coincidental twist that Daniel Jones replaced Eli Manning in week 3 of 2019 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Tampa. They end up winning that game. Jones runs in the touchdown, then they get the missed field goal at the end by Tampa. They win that game. At that point, Jones is lauded as the heir apparent, has now taken over from Eli Manning. And we all know 6 years later how that has turned out. And again, with that twist of fate, the Giants getting ready to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers here, not in Tampa, but now Daniel Jones loses that job to Tommy DeVito. I don't think many people are viewing Tommy DeVito as the heir apparent, but this certainly is a conclusion for Daniel Jones. So let's talk Jones first, and then we can get into the DeVito Drew Lock situation and why that decision was made, or why I believe that decision was made. I wrote this column. I wrote several columns on Daniel Jones. The reality is that, yes, there were financial implications. You had the $23 million injury guarantee. And what does that mean? A lot of people just throw that out there and just kind of gloss over it and think it was automatic. That if the guy had, a sore shoulder, that all of a sudden it would cost the Giants $23 million. That's not the case. What the injury guarantee is that if a player is injured enough where he cannot pass a physical on the 5th day of the new league year, so for the Giants and for the NFL going into 2025, that's in March. So if Daniel Jones re-injured his ACL and he could not pass a physical in March, then that $23 million injury guarantee would trigger, and it would go on the books for the Giants. Now, that's cap space that wouldn't be there normally, and all of a sudden you have a quarterback who you were going to look to get rid of is now injured, and now you're paying him an additional $23 million. That's out of play right now, because the Giants are moving Tommy DeVito up from QB3, which technically in-game, it was an emergency situation, but now you look at a different situation. Daniel Jones will now be inactive on game day. He will dress, and he will be the emergency quarterback. Now, remember, it's Brian Daboll and the coaching staff's decision whether or not to go to that third emergency quarterback. So the reality is that if the Giants were in a circumstance where Tommy DeVito were injured and then Drew Lock were injured, there's no guarantees that the Giants would go to Daniel Jones on a game day and risk that injury guarantee. So that's the reason for DeVito flipping from 3 to 1 and Jones flipping back from 1 to 3. So where does the blame fall here? The blame falls on everyone. And, I had Olivia Newton-John in the back of my mind, and I'll explain that in a second. The Giants were hoping that Daniel Jones would become what they thought he could be, the quarterback that they thought he could be. Right now, they were hopelessly devoted to him. Get it? Get it? Anyone who knows Grease, you got that connection? Well, that's my dad joke for the day. Being in my early 50s, I can, make those Grease jokes. But anyway, the hope was gone this year for Daniel Jones. And we can talk about Pat Shurmur and Mike Shula and Joe Judge and Jason Garrett and Freddie Kitchens and Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka and all of the coaches that have been with Daniel Jones since he was drafted in 2019. John Mara was right. The Giants did everything they could to screw him up. But somewhere along the line, Jones got screwed up himself. He's no longer the freewheeling, aggressive quarterback that when he was a rookie, I remember Evan Ingram coming to me when Jones was named the starter and talking about Jones in practice, just flinging the ball all over and not being afraid to throw the ball into traffic. And through the regimes and the different coaching changes, they neutered Daniel Jones. And you try to pull that back out of him, and you got 2022. And you have to mention Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones from 2022. But the reality is, if you were watching the football this year, this was also a football decision. Daniel Jones has missed a lot of plays. And Brian Daboll said back in the spring, talking about explosive plays and what they needed out of this offense and what you need to win in the NFL, there are 4 or 5 plays in a game where you get the opportunity to make those plays. And if you don't make them as an offense, it changes your game. It changes the complexion of your game. And the Giants have had 3 to 4 pass plays in almost every game this season that if Jones hits 1 or 2 of them, the game might look differently. That's why you talk about that one score situation, how the Giants are 1-6 in one score games this year. And that 6, it's not really a one score game. It was the Bengals game. And we all know that was a late touchdown to put the game away. It was cosmetic. That was a one score game as well. So 1-5, and then that extra game against the Bengals. They won those one score games in 2022. Why? Because they made plays when it counted. Daniel Jones has gotten to the point now where he's not making the plays that are there. He's making bad decisions, and he's not reading the field at all. Now, I know all the critics of Daniel Jones will look at this and say, well, we've been telling you that for 5 years. Jones can't read the field. Jones is a one read and throw guy. Well, Dable gave him one read and throw plays this year that were open, and Jones didn't pull the trigger. And I keep going back to that flea flicker, because that flea flicker, it wasn't the final nail in, boy, now that he missed that play, we got to get rid of Daniel Jones. It was just the combination, the collection, the culmination of everything that had gone wrong for Daniel Jones the last 2 years. Put the injuries aside, and you can't do that last year. But when Daniel Jones was healthy in the first quarter against Vegas, when he came back from the 3-game absence from the neck injury, and he overthrew Saquon Barkley on the sideline in the first quarter before he tore his ACL, and you just looked at it and you said you hope that Daniel Jones comes back this year and is able to rediscover, find it, coach it out of him, coach it back into him. And they just couldn't do it. But that flea flicker, I know there was a lot of talk in the moment of it's 3rd and 1, you're at midfield. What's Brian Dable doing calling a flea flicker? You've got an offense that can't score, that can't hit big plays. There's not a better time to call a 3rd and 1 play at midfield, because you don't anticipate your quarterback taking a sack. You're handing off to Tyrone Tracy. Tyrone Tracy's flipping it back. As soon as Tyrone Tracy flips the ball back to Daniel Jones, Jones has to know, okay, and I don't care which way you read it, whether you read it Wan'Dale Robinson and then Malik Neighbors, or Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson, it's catch, throw, ball's out. And they were wide open. Now, Neighbors was a little bit more covered because it would have had to be a layered throw, but Jones is looking left the entire time. Wan'Dale Robinson is streaking wide open. And what do? Okay, so if you're not confident in making the throw, Daniel, throw the ball out of bounds. Throw it as far as you can in either direction out of bounds. What does he do? He takes the sack. Why was that terrible? Well, because it led to a punt. Brian Dable's going for it on 4th and 1 there. And the way they were running the football, they're getting that first down. And the drive is going to continue. So it was a chance worth taking. Unfortunately, the quarterback did not make that play. And then they end up losing the game 20-17. I know Tracy's fumbling overtime, but it was the big picture. When you're on Monday Night Football, and Troy Aikman, who's a Hall of Fame quarterback, I know he's a Cowboy, so Giants fans do not like him. It's just kind of embedded. You have to dislike Troy Aikman. But when he's talking about the anticipation of a quarterback, and he's saying that Daniel Jones has zero anticipation of what the plays are going to be. And the perfect play was the one to Darius Slayton, where he got past the first line of defense, and he was running into a void. And Daniel Jones waited until he got open to throw the ball, and it got Slayton essentially murdered from behind by one of the DBs because he let him in. And then you have Kurt Warner on the Germany broadcast essentially saying everything that the plays are there and Daniel Jones just isn't seeing them. It leads to what happened on Monday morning. Now, here's what I think or what I know happened last week. Let's rewind the clock. Joe Shane talked on Tuesday. He had his bye-week press conference. Then they had practice that day. My understanding, it was not a full practice. It was a practice. It was individual drills to get the guys out there on the field, and then they had developmental periods. So there was no depth chart per se in terms of who's getting reps, who's not. Most, if not all, the players who played in Germany did not participate in practice, or it was a very, very light practice for them. Then the players leave on Tuesday. The coaches get together and self-evaluate all the way through the weekend, and then they get to Monday morning. The players come back. Brian Daboll meets with the quarterbacks. He fills them in on the decision, then meets with the team, lets the team know, and then they move forward here. How do you sum up Daniel Jones? Well, first off, Daniel Jones has been a guest on this podcast. From day one of Daniel Jones being here as part of this franchise, I'm just going to tell you, as far as a reporter goes and a person and man to man, it's not easy. It's not easy. I like Daniel Jones. I like a lot of players I cover. I don't like all of the players I cover, but it's a professional atmosphere. I wanted to see Daniel Jones succeed. Maybe not as bad as John Mara and some of the people inside the Giants organization, but I wanted to see him succeed. 4 different times, and I counted it yesterday, I wrote a column after a game and said the Giants have found their franchise quarterback because I believed it. That was the tease of Daniel Jones. He gave you just enough in a couple spots to make you believe, if we fix the line and if we keep the playmakers healthy and if we get the right play caller, get the right coach, we can get Daniel Jones to be the next Eli Manning. Is that fair? No. But that's ultimately what Daniel Jones worked against. So from a personal aspect, I hated writing the column coming out of Germany that it was time. The Daniel Jones era was over. The Giants needed to bench Daniel Jones and move on. A clean break from the marriage that was. But it's not always easy. This job is not always easy. Believe me. I'm not getting $82 million that Daniel Jones got from the Giants in order to endure what he's endured the last 2 years. Let's just put that out there. Okay? Daniel Jones will be fine. Daniel Jones will be healthy. He will likely latch on somewhere as a backup quarterback with a chance to start, and maybe he resurrects his career. Maybe all of a sudden he starts reading plays and doesn't feel the pressure of being in New York and living up to the 6th overall pick. Maybe. But the Giants paid him $82 million guaranteed. Since he signed that contract, Daniel Jones and the teams that he's quarterbacked are 3-13. They're 0-5 this year at home. There were 4 games, as I mentioned, that I thought that Daniel Jones put that statement out there that he was the guy. And I'll give him to you. His debut in Tampa Bay, wrote that column that he was the guy. In 2021 in New Orleans, when they came back and won in New Orleans, I remember writing after that, Daniel Jones just proved that the Giants have their guy. Then in 2022, the Colts game at home. Daniel Jones played great, but it was the feeling in that stadium. The fans chanting his name, coming off the field, how much of a lift that was, making the playoffs. You can get caught up in the emotion. And I said, you know what? The Giants have their guy. And then the week after that, when they were, or 2 weeks after that, when they were in Minnesota for the playoff game, I don't think anyone in that locker room after that game would have said, boy, in 2 years, Daniel Jones is going to make you look really, really bad if you give him a contract extension. That was his moment. You had a locker room chanting his name. It went from the fans in the stands when they clinched the playoffs to his teammates chanting his name. Should we have seen it as fool's gold? I asked Joe Shane that at his press conference, and he said, you know what? Not just Jones, but that entire season, in hindsight, maybe it blinded them a little bit. The success blinded them. Maybe they made decisions. They tried accelerating the timeline because they were signing Daniel Jones, and he knew he had that out after 2 years, which the Giants will now take advantage of. But that was put into the contract. And now you're where you're at. So who is the quarterback for the Giants in 2025? Well, the first guy to get a chance at showing he can be that is Tommy DeVito. So let's talk a little bit about Tommy DeVito. I know there are fans who believe, boy, you're going to sell tickets now, or people are going to want to flock to the stadium to cheer on Tommy DeVito. Look, I'm from North Jersey. Our producer, Paul Wood, he's a Giants fan, season ticket holder. He's from North Jersey. Loves the DeVito story. I covered Tommy DeVito a little bit when he was at Don Bosco. That Tommy DeVito story that started in the spring of last year as an undrafted rookie, nobody covered it closer than I did. But if you're talking making a dent in MetLife Stadium on a game day on Sunday, you're talking 70, 80,000 seat stadium, 82.5, I think it is. Maybe 5,000. Let's go over the top. Let's say 10,000 people are going to show up because they want to root on Tommy DeVito. That's not making a dent for John Mara in his wallet. That is not the impact of his popularity to make that kind of impact. But it's not about money from that perspective. The perception, now I will agree with you. You put Tommy DeVito as the starting quarterback on Sunday, he's got a little bit longer leash from a good portion of the fan base, I think, on Sunday to not get booed when his first pass sails over a receiver. Or the Giants have only scored 3 points in the first 2 quarters and they're sitting at halftime. DeVito himself is not getting booed. If it's Drew Lock, yeah, those people who won't boo Tommy DeVito will boo Drew Lock. So from that perspective, I agree with the fans who have said that. Now, are there Giants fans who, because Daniel Jones has been benched, will now think about using their tickets on Sunday rather than staying home and not going? Well, maybe. So maybe there are less empty seats in the stadium than there would be if Daniel Jones or Drew Lock was the quarterback. But the reality is, if you're a season ticket holder and you have to pay PSLs and you had an opportunity to sell your tickets, you've probably sold them already, number one. Number two, if a Tampa Bay Bucks fan looks on the secondary market and wants tickets, you're probably going to sell your tickets to Tampa Bay. Don't tell me you're not going to take $100 when you pay the astronomical fees for your PSL, and as Giants fans, you've taken a beating for a decade. You can't tell me that you're not going to sell those tickets because Tommy DeVito all of a sudden is the starting quarterback. I'm not even sure if Mr. and Mrs. DeVito wouldn't sell their tickets if they had a PSL in order to make that money back. So that's where I sit with the whole popularity. This is why they did it. They wanted Tommy Cutlets. They wanted that. Ultimately, that is not the case. Okay, so why did they go to Tommy DeVito? Well, here's what I believe. I believe that Brian Daboll looked at the body of work that he has and this offense, and he's making the decision now that with what they have in this offense and the plays they're calling and the plays that Daniel Jones is missing, who gives me the best chance to take advantage of those plays? What can I do? You're not running read option with Drew Lock. You can run it a little bit with Tommy DeVito. Tommy DeVito can move. Now, Tommy DeVito took a ton of sacks last year. A lot of that was his processing. It goes right back to Daniel Jones. But let's not pretend that this offensive line is the same offensive line as last year. Yes, Tommy DeVito got to play with Andrew Thomas, but that offensive line wasn't great last year. They were on their way to giving up a record number of sacks. This offensive line is better. This running game is better. That's not a slap against Saquon Barkley, but it's a tip of the cap to Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary and this offense and what Tommy DeVito can do on Sunday. Now, I've been bothered by this. I understand why people are saying this. And I understand there are people with pitchforks, and it's the idea of Joe Shane's got to go, Brian Dable's got to go. They've got to rebuild. They got to tear down, rebuild again. And I can't argue with the results that are there. But if you go back to March, and now everybody is using that against Joe Shane and saying, why did he give Drew Lock $5 million to be the backup? If now he's got an opportunity to play as backup, why is he playing Tommy DeVito over Drew Lock? If they were going to make this decision, Dable and Shane, why didn't they just make Tommy DeVito the number 2 back in March? Let me take you back to March. Daniel Jones was not cleared from his ACL. The Giants had no idea, no way of guessing. If they had made a decision and said, you know what, we're not signing a veteran backup. Tommy DeVito is our backup. He's going to be our guy throughout the spring. Remember, Drew Lock was the guy throughout the spring when Daniel Jones was trying to get back and be back in August. They also didn't know if they were going to draft a quarterback in late April when they made that decision to give Drew Lock $5 million. They had to protect themselves in that moment. The going rate for a backup quarterback, especially with what Drew Lock did last year, especially with Seattle also wanting Lock back, was $5 million. It's basically paying for car insurance, not getting into a car accident, and then getting upset because you had to pay your car insurance. The Giants in November, 8 months after that decision was made, are in a different spot than what they would have been in August. If Daniel Jones did not clear and was still out, they would have started the season with Drew Lock. Maybe Tommy DeVito would have come on very quickly after that. I can't say that. Now, again, I understand. You want to look at it. I think people want to look at the reality of, well, this is Joe Shane's decision to know. Sure. A lot of his job is predictive, trying to figure out what the market is for running backs, what the market is for safeties, who will be after your guys if you let them go. Yes. But I don't have a problem with them bypassing Drew Lock and going to Tommy DeVito. Has nothing to do with the incentives that were floating out there yesterday for Drew Lock. Yes, there's a playing time incentive. I believe it's 40% of the snaps for the season that Drew Lock would get $250,000. I know everybody remembers the Nick McLeod decision from last week and says, it was penny pinching and it was a salary cap decision to cut Nick McLeod. The Giants didn't cut Nick McLeod only to save $900,000. They cut Nick McLeod because they had been trying to get him to take a pay cut for the entire season. And they viewed the second half that McLeod was not going to be a big factor in the secondary, and they did not want to pay $900,000. Again, it's not $900,000 over the course of the season. It's $900,000 for the final 10 games of the season to be a gunner. They didn't want that. And I think people are caught up in that and said, well, Joe Shane's pinching pennies. He saved $900,000. He screwed the salary cap up. First off, the salary cap was terrible when he got here, and he did his best. The Giants have dug out of that. Has Shane made mistakes? Yes. I know I've been accused of carrying the water for ownership and for Joe Shane and Brian Dable. I'm just giving you my honest opinion. And people can laugh at that. But the reality is that this was not an easy job for Joe Shane to take on. But he took it, and he inherits the responsibility of getting it right. But 17 touchdown passes was the incentive for Drew Lock. Now, you're trying to tell me 17 touchdown passes and 2,000 yards passing. You're trying to tell me that the Giants are afraid that over the final 7 games, Drew Lock is going to get 17 touchdown passes and 2,000 yards passing for an offense that's averaging 15 points a game. That's why Tommy DeVito is starting, because they're afraid that Drew Lock is going to hit those incentives. Well, guess what? If that's true, which I don't believe it is, then the Giants should have been playing Drew Lock and would have been playing Drew Lock in week 2 of the season. because the way Daniel Jones looked against the Vikings in week 1 played out over the course of the season. So Drew Lock is not hitting his statistical incentives. It's not happening. But when it looks like, well, they're rattled and they're reeling and they're trying to save their jobs and all this stuff, Joe Schoen looks bad or opens himself up to criticism if Tommy DeVito starts. Maybe it's a good thing that Joe Schoen is allowing Brian Daboll to play the quarterback that he wants to play, that he believes he can win with. Schoen could easily have a fight between general manager and head coach and say, look, we paid this guy $5 million back in March. We've got to play this guy. We've got to at least give him a shot. Then he doesn't get criticized. The reality is, you're looking at the final 7 games. Yes, John Mara gave a vote of confidence. But if these 7 games go poorly and there's more embarrassment to come, nobody has a lifetime contract. We don't know what John Mara will do. We don't know what ownership will do. I can tell you this, I don't believe the GM would move past the head coach and say, I got to get another head coach in here. I still believe that they are in lockstep and they are doing everything they can to help each other succeed. And we'll see if they can win some games here. I know that won't make people happy. If you're chasing you're chasing the reality of a draft pick. If they win some games, they're not going to be happy. But I tell you what, you look at what the Cowboys look like on Monday night against Houston, that Thanksgiving Day game, boy, is going to be a doozy. Giants haven't won in Dallas since 2016. You think Giants fans will be happy on Thanksgiving if they somehow beat the Cowboys? There'll be some who are upset. Meaningless game, but that's the way it's at. So that's where we're at with everything. We'll have plenty of time to talk about who the quarterback will be next year. I believe draft is in play. I believe a free agent like a Sam Darnold would be in play, maybe a Justin Fields, just to kind of be that bridge quarterback, somebody that Brian Daboll believes he can win with. Yes, I still believe Brian Daboll will be the head coach for next year, but could there be a trade on the table? Could Atlanta turn it over to Michael Penix and now all of a sudden be looking to get rid of Kirk Cousins? It's possible. I told you about the Trevor Lawrence thing. I'd be very interested to see how that plays out with Jacksonville over the next 2 months because I think there's going to be a new regime down there, and that ownership, they like attention. They're involved in AEW. We know Tony Khan and AEW, if you're a wrestling fan, pro wrestling fan, they're involved with that. So the impact of Tommy DeVito on this offense, we'll see. I think it becomes more of a running game situation. I think they're going to run Tyrone Tracy, and I think they found something in the running game. And I think they believe that they could get out in front in games and then allow the play action game to kind of take over. Malik Neighbors, will he be more active now with DeVito at quarterback? It's a good question. I know my producer Paul was asking it. The reality is that I think Malik Neighbors needs to step up a little bit right now. Hearing some whispers from inside the building that, not bad things, but just the idea of a lot of the younger players, it's wearing on them, losing. And, you start looking around and, maybe you slack off a little bit in practice. That can't happen. And I think Neighbors needs to take this time off and kind of re-energize his batteries. Remember, the college season is essentially done for a lot of these guys. They would have had a bye week already, and they're looking at 1 or 2 more games, and then that's it, and it's done. Guys have been shutting down and not participating in bowl games now. So you're not even getting that extra month and a half of practice time and being out on the field. So the Giants have played the most rookies in the league. That's an important pressure point here, I think, for the Giants. Neighbors is obviously important, not just the rookies, but go back to last year. What happens with Tay Banks the rest of the way? Even go 2 years ago. Does Kayvon Thibodeau come back off of IR this week? Going into the bye, there was a good feeling that he would be back. having talked to Kayvon, but we'll see. We'll see what decisions they end up making coming back from that wrist. You don't want to rush him back either in a lost season. You want to make sure he's healthy. So the last part of this, and then we'll wrap it up for today, is the idea that this locker room. How does this locker room react to the Daniel Jones news? This was not like last year, where if they had gone to Tyrod Taylor, there were players in the locker room who could see the body of work of Tyrod Taylor. It's not the same with Tommy DeVito. And here's where I'm going to praise Saquon Barkley. If not for Saquon Barkley, who knows if Tommy DeVito does what he does last year? Because Saquon Barkley was out front, making sure that that locker room respected Tommy DeVito. Now it's up to Tommy DeVito. He's got to continue the respect with the way he works and how he plays. But you don't have a Saquon Barkley standing up and defending DeVito. And that's important. It's very important. And back in the summer, Tommy DeVito talked about how he wanted to move on from what people considered a sideshow. The this and the jersey and the Italian and the agent. You already saw Sean Stellato, the agent, who also represents Chris Manhertz, by the way, on the Giants. So it's not just Tommy DeVito's agent, Sean Stellato, but he's already, making his appearance. The big thing is, does this defense believe in the offense with Tommy DeVito in charge? Because with Dexter Lawrence is very close to Daniel Jones. And DeVito's got to win these guys over by the way he performs. Bottom line, that's it. Nobody else is convincing the defense that Tommy DeVito can play. Tommy DeVito is the only player who can convince the defense that he's ready to go. And that starts on Sunday. So if I'm Tommy DeVito, it's none of this. It's none of the agents. I'm not making any signings during the year. It's all about ball. Because that's really how Tommy DeVito even got into this position last year. And from talking to Tommy DeVito and conversations we've had, I believe that that's going to be his next step. He does not want to be known as Tommy Cutlets. He does not want to be the guy who is compared to the Jersey Shore and everybody's fist bumping or doing this. Tommy DeVito wants to be seen as a football player. Everything else is nice. His 15 minutes of fame, it's great. But the football was really good at times by Tommy DeVito last year. And then it tailed off pretty quickly. I think the biggest difference now has to be with Brian Daboll calling the plays, believing in Tommy DeVito. And I could tell you, Daboll believes in Tommy DeVito's talent. That he's more talent than people give him credit for. Talked about his release yesterday. And I mean this release. I don't mean getting released. I think the reality is that it's go time. It's go time for Tommy DeVito. It's go time for Brian Daboll. And the first time he hits a big play to Malik Neighbors, if he does, or hits a deep ball to Jalen Hyatt, this offense will believe. And you've got enough young guys who are not attached to Daniel Jones. Defense, it's a little different. You've got guys who are friendly with Daniel Jones, who respect Daniel Jones. Number one, Dexter Lawrence. I have to believe that Brian Daboll had conversations with Dexter Lawrence about this. So now it's a matter of stepping up. You're going to feel for Daniel Jones. You're going to respect Daniel Jones. But now it's about Tommy DeVito and what comes next for the Giants. And it's going to be interesting on Sunday. Brings a little juice, a little different juice than what the Giants would have been had they been, stumbling out of the bye at 2-8. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden they're going to go on a winning streak. Heck, they may be down 2 touchdowns on Sunday before we blink an eye. But the reality is that there are things to kind of focus on and talk about here. And to me, it's not about firing Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll. It's about seeing over the next 7 games if they can show you what I believe and that this team is moving in the right direction. They haven't shown it on the scoreboard. They haven't shown it in the standings. They need to show it on the field first, and then everything else will take care of itself. Again, for Paul Wood, I'm Art Stapleton. Appreciate you watching. We'll see what we can do about a pregame, a preview show that later this week when we get into the locker room and get a feel for what's going on, but we haven't been there yet. But I appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, we are all in. We appreciate you being all in too. And it's DeVito time, Tommy Cutlets, whatever you want to call him. To me, he's the kid from Cedar Grove who has another opportunity to kind of win over this fan base and get some wins for a coaching staff and a front office that desperately needs them over the final 7 games of the year.